everyone, I'm Lisa Walton and welcome to Quilt Stories. Today I'm chatting with Paula Nadelstern, who's in New York in lockdown, doing lots of Zoom meetings and having a great time on Zoom, but not being able to get out much, which is sort of what everybody is doing at the moment. And Paula's been creating, and we're going to be talking about one of her quilts, which is number 41 in her series, which is pretty amazing. I know many of you are familiar with Paula's work and also her beautiful, beautiful fabric, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So, hi, Paula.
Hi, Lisa. It's nice to be here. Lisa, do you remember that I actually have been in your house? I used to teach on cruises and travel around, and on one of my quilt cruises, I ended up in Sydney, and you and I connected. It was wonderful. So I've
You
actually
did.
been
I
to your house.
remember it was a really, really, really rainy night, and I drove out to your hotel to get you, and I'm not really good at driving at night, and certainly not in the rain. It was one of those, oh my
You're
goodness,
you're absolutely
experiences.
right. It was pouring the whole time we were in Sydney. It was pouring, but we had a good time.
It was lovely to meet you and your husband. It was great. I do remember that very, very clearly. Okay, so we're going to just have a look at your presentations. It is amazing how quilters can connect all over the world, really, isn't
We're
it?
so lucky. Just in terms of COVID and this isolation, the memories like that, this accidental career of mine, because I don't have an art background and certainly never intended to be a professional quilter, art quilter, or someone who traveled as much as I did. I mean, we took everything for granted, really. I have so many astounding memories, and I'm so glad that I did do the things that I did and met the amazing people. And when I even think back to this career, really it is meeting the quilter and being all over that has been so wonderful and beautiful.
I agree. It's the connections we make. Who would have thought? Obviously, you didn't think you were going to do it. I certainly didn't think I was going to see so much of the world and meet people.
In a minute, I'll
Okay.
be showing my first quilt made in 1969. So certainly when I first started quilting, I mean, there wasn't even a category as like professional quilter or a quilter on the circuit.
This quilt we have here is kaleidoscopic, and I had to check my Roman numerals, but it's 41, and
Yes,
you told me you're already working on 42.
I'm working on 43. I started 43 in March when we all started to quarantine, and when a lot of women and quilters started to make masks. Rather than making masks, first of all, I don't sew very well, to tell you the truth, but rather than making masks, thought I actually started to make a quilt, number 43. So I haven't finished that. My quilts take sometimes a year or two with other stuff going on in between. I hope to get back to that quilt, number 43, which I think I'm going to call to continue to continue, different kind of kaleidoscope.
Well, this one's certainly a very complex one, and we'll have a look at it a little bit in the design phases. Actually got a photo of your first quilt in 1969, which is a far cry from this latest, the kaleidoscopic series.
Yes,
So
although
do you want
there's
to tell
a
us?
little similarity, because you can see even back in 1969 when I was, 17 years old and went to college with my featherweight, which I used to call an old machine, until I got the book, the little featherweight book, and I read that my sewing machine was born in, was actually a year younger than I am, so I stopped calling it an old machine. But I worked, so me and my featherweight went to college together, and I ripped up all my clothes into 10-inch squares and called it a quilt, although actually it was not quilted. It was meant to stuff, a blanket inside, and I was very, very proud of it. Years later, when Quilters Newsletter was doing an article about first quilt, last quilt, and I actually sent that quilt, they called me and said, "Oh, thank you so much, because everybody else's quilt really looks so great, their first quilt, and yours at least, looks like a first quilt." I did use a lot of fabric. I thought there'd come a day when I would, back in the early 70s, when I'd be a real quilter and make a quilt out of 2 or 3 fabrics. But I never became that real quilter. I just constantly use more, as much fabric as possible.
Do you still have your first quilt?
This quilt,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it was actually being pulled out of my parents' out of a house on Eastern Long Island for a yard sale when I grabbed it and thought, you know what, maybe I should keep it. So that it is someplace, but I don't actually know where it is.
We have you doing something odd. So would you like to tell us what you're doing?
Well, you can see how most of my fabric looks like that. Looks very holy. I consider it blessed because it's holy, because I, cut repeats out. And on the left side, I'm wrapped up in my work. Um, I live in the Bronx, which is one of the boroughs of New York City. And a few years ago, I got involved with an artist documentary project where photographers came to the studios of a very, very different kind of artists. I mean, some people were graffiti artists, and somebody was 100 years old and someone was 18 years old. And it was a really, I didn't expect to enjoy the process as much as I did, and getting to know all these people. And so this photographer who I live on the same block in the Bronx where I was born,
Oh,
which is pretty, unusual. And so the photographer actually was someone I'd gone to elementary school with, who lives here also, but we hadn't, been in touch. We hadn't seen each other. And so he's the one who suggested that I kind of wrap myself up in these remnants, and it's been a fun quilt to over the years. So I
that's
get wrapped
great.
up in my work.
I love it. So you didn't start out, obviously, designing your own fabrics. I have a photo here of some Liberty fabric.
Yeah, it was about 1986, and I found a store, not a quilt store, a little north of here. I saw this piece of Liberty of London fabric, which at the time was only 36 inches wide and cost like $16 a yard. And
Mhm.
I was a stay-at-home mom, and I just loved it. And I had this intuitive sense that I didn't know the term for bilateral symmetry. I didn't know the technique of a kaleidoscope, but I had this sense that if I cut this into triangles, identical triangles, I could make what I thought would be a kaleidoscope. And so when people often ask me, like, what was the initial, reference for my kaleidoscope theme? Did I have kaleidoscopes as a kid? No, it was really finding this one piece of fabric. And, as a stay-at-home mom, I didn't have a lot of extra cash. And all I wanted to do was buy a quarter yard of the fabric going from selvage to selvage, which would have been $4. And I just kept walking in and out of that store thinking, oh, I can't spend that much fabric. It's that much money. It would just seem so expensive. And I asked Barbara Brackman and some other people, do they know when we first started using the term fat quarter? Because that this was, it had not been invented at the point that I was purchasing this fabric from edge to edge. But you can see in the other image on the right what I mean when I say bilateral symmetry. It really means that there's this sense of a line down the middle of the pattern, an implied line where whatever happens to the left mirror images and happens to the right. And that's really, that concept is really what has propelled me. I don't only use symmetrical fabrics, but I often use them as my starting point.
Do you have a maths background?
I'm terrible at math. I mean, I know that my work sort of suggests that I'm someone other than I am, really, because I know it looks like I'm very compulsive. I'm not compulsive. It looks like, I really care tremendously about my points meeting, and that I'm very fussy and stuff like that. I'm not that person at all. If someone ever looks at, the work and thinks and points to something and goes, oh, look, like, that doesn't match or something, I just think to myself, oh, get a life. I mean, I'm not that person. In fact, my first quilts, I was doing crafts since I was 16, and I was embroidering and crocheting. I mean, really, when someone says, how did I start? I was part of the hippie time, and that's, we were doing doing macrame. We were doing a little bit of everything. And my work kind of looked a lot like, a Susie Shy or something. It had more of that less precise work. And I think because I could do that so easily, I got myself to, more and more. I'm not a great sewist. I'm not technically proficient. I don't care what thread I use. I don't, I'm just fascinated by the fabric and the process. That's
Yeah.
really my motivation.
So this is your first attempt at a kaleidoscopic
Well, this
quilt?
is when I bought that quarter yard of Liberty of London fabric and then went back for more fabric. This is the first quilt that I made from it. It was actually it was a commission work. There's a block in it to the left, like almost like rows from the bottom, 2 rows up. That's called a needle star. And I've used that pattern, and I use that term ever since. So although this is the first quilt I did, you can see they're more straight lines. I've learned to really make it feel more like a kaleidoscope. Well, I've been introduced to kaleidoscopes, actual state-of-the-art kaleidoscopes, and that whole culture of people, which have many of them have become my very great friends, and I do have a collection of kaleidoscopes. So this is kind of a more static image of, using the Liberty fabric. And when I mentioned that idea of the needle star pattern, the reason that's such a clever term, and I say that facetiously, is that my last name, Nadelstern, translates into needle star. So I've used that needle star idea like quite a few times, and I still can use that pattern. And if anyone remembers when the Hilton in Houston, Texas, took my designs and turned them into a carpet, a very large carpet, the needle star pattern was one of the ones I was very easily able to identify. And there is a little bit on that. It's a little hard, I'm sure, for you to see, but actually in that needle star right there, there's a little bit of that red ianthe Liberty of London fabric that we saw a slide of early.
And actually, Needle Star is your email address too, isn't it? That's really
cute. Yes, it is.
Who's this hunk?
I found this ad in a New Yorker magazine after I made that quilt in about '86. And you can, of course, tell why I was so attracted to it. There is a piece of the red ianthe fabric in the corner. My eyes went straight there. And that denim jacket that he has casually slung over his shoulder was a $350, that lined the denim jacket, and it's a $350 jacket. And based on, finding that, I sent a slide of the quilt I just showed you to the New York Liberty office, and I got a commission to do a series of pillows that sold in their store.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
This is one of them. This is one of the first Liberty pillows, and they gave me a lot of their scraps, so I was only to use Liberty fabric. And I always have felt that it's very interesting that at the same time that I received these fabrics and I was working for Liberty, there was a quilter in England who I've never met named Deirdre Amston. And she also was given a lot of the Liberty scraps from the people in London. And she did the series of quilts that we've come to know as watercolor quilts. That was really, she came to quilting with an art quilt background and understood the idea of color wash, while I didn't. And I really kind of invented it for myself and realized like the Liberty lends itself to that soft movement from patch to patch. And that's the way I like to use it. And I also realized that's the way I liked my kaleidoscopes to look. And so while making these, I don't remember how many, 16 or so pillows that were about 24 inches wide, then they were squared off with fabric in the corners. While I did that, I really started to learn one of the strategies I use in my quilting, which is to really camouflage the seams and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Yeah, this is, but to me, it's not math, it's just spatial relations. And it's really, so I draw the angle, and on my website and in my books, I give a way that I've, over many, many years, quilters have helped me figure out this excellent way for creating the perfect angle. Because the idea is that a kaleidoscope functions like a circle. Like, this is all the math I know, Lisa, I promise you. A kaleidoscope functions like a circle, and a circle has 360 degrees in it. And for someone who's told you she's kind of messy and not compulsive, like, why is it so important that I hit 360 degrees? Well, that's because what I'm going to do is take 360, divide it by the number of pieces of pie. And I don't mean the math pie. I mean like apple pie or pecan pie or pizza pie. And so if I take 360 and divide it by 8, you get the number 45. So I need to have a 45-degree angle at the top, at the apex, at the very tip top of my triangle. And where 8 times 45 equals 336, 8 times 46 is going to be 368. So that's 8 degrees too much. That needs to go someplace. And when you were hoping for it to be nice and flat, it's not. It's going to pop up like a nipple, really, at the top, or you'll fall into a little crater if you don't have that amount. And the same thing goes for along the sides, the legs of the triangle. And that's something it took me a while to realize. If at the outside of your triangle, you again don't have the correct angle that you need, if you have a couple of degrees less, it's going to curve into a ball. And if you have a couple of degrees too many, it's gonna go flounce, that's what it'll do. It'll flounce like a poodle skirt from the 50s. So that becomes, that becomes more technique than numbers to me. It's something I've learned to be careful and cautious. I mean, sometimes I think it's extremely odd that I'm the one who's going around the world and teaching people to be a little, a little patient, or because I'm not. And it's interesting because I don't know if you know the magnificent kimonos of Ichiku Kubota, but like that
love
place
it.
in Japan is like my Disneyland. It's like my favorite place in the entire world. I just love his work so much. And one day, listening to his video in English, I heard him say exactly that, like how he's not a patient person, and it's just strange that he's the one doing this such meticulous work and stuff like that. So I don't consider the work meticulous because, I know where I can fudge it a little more, where it's going to matter and where it's not, what the eye's gonna see. But the place I do have to be careful is right in that center where I have to hit that angle. Now on the right, what I'm showing you is that ultimately I don't piece curves. I didn't start out doing that, and where I probably could have learned over the years, I instead, even if one of those patches, it could have one or it could have 30 fabrics in there, but ultimately there will be straight lines that I can sew together.
You mentioned Kubota. I lead tours to Japan, and his museum is absolutely always a highlight. And the first time I went there, I actually cried. It was just
Me
so
too.
amazing.
Me too. I was teaching in Japan for the first time, and I said that's where I want to go, and they basically, bought me a bus ticket or told me which bus station to go to. And I woke up at like, 5 a.m, where everyone else American goes to the auction for tuna or something. I found my way to the bus station, and I got on the bus, and I'm on the bus to, where am I on the bus to? I have no idea. I'm sitting there on this bus thinking, how will I know when to get off the bus? What am I doing? And eventually, the bus just stopped. Everyone got off and I got off, and a taxi driver opened the door and I got in, and he took me to the museum, and there was this giant door that I managed to open up, and I was the only one there. It was so early in the morning, and they offered me this, that I could see this video in English, and I just sat there and cried. I just couldn't believe I was there.
Yeah, absolutely. Recommended for any textile artist. You have to go there if you go to Japan. Okay, so we're getting a bit more complicated here.
Yeah, I wanted to show that this is, my drawings do get lots of lines, and but everything on the graph paper, so that with that bold line down the middle, so I understand what's the center, and I understand that whatever lands to the left or the right along the legs of the triangle are going to bump into themselves again. Also, I have this slide here to talk about, the importance of working in a series, which I didn't understand when I started to work in the series. I didn't know what a gift I was giving myself, maybe because, I don't have an art background. So I actually thought it was a problem to make kaleidoscopic 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, but I couldn't stop myself. I thought, oh, it'd be better to be a dabbler. It'd be better to make every single type of traditional quilt. But I kept coming back because I had so many questions. And one of the things that I learned because I worked in the series was I wanted to make my angles even narrower. Where 45 degrees and maybe 36 degrees was like the narrowest I could get to without having a big mess in the middle. But when I spoke to my friends, the kaleidoscope makers, they like having, in their actual state-of-the-art kaleidoscopes, they like very narrow angles because then the audience cannot identify what is in the kaleidoscope as it moves really quickly. Like imagine, that I have a piece of fabric right smack in the center, which is a perfectly symmetrical cat's face. And then my audience is going to look at that and go, oh, look, there's a cat's face. Oh my God, did I remember to feed the cat? I better go home now instead of, like looking at my work. So that stops the action. You don't want any, you don't want a heart. You don't want anything identifiable. You want details. And how could I get something that was fewer than, narrower, like my kaleidoscope friends? And finally, because, you're priming yourself when you work in a series, because the questions you ask yourself get more complex, but the answers get simpler. And so I realized one day, if I made 16 wedges, well, 360 degrees divided by 16 is 22 and a half. So I'm making 16 wedges, 22 and a half. I sew 2 of them together, and now I've got 22 and a half and 22 and a half, which is 45. I do 45 degrees all the time. It's part of the quilt culture, pioneer. I mean, people have been doing 45-degree quilts for years. But what I now have are 16 pieces, patches that need to meet in the middle. So I'm looking again at the graph paper on the left side, and you can see that there's in the graph paper that's on the left side, but to the lower right, that what I've done is I've sewn the two triangles together, but I've cut them at like 1 3/8 and added another wedge that's 45 degrees. And that wedge goes in the center. And so in the center, I have this very neat 8. And your eye, your eye doesn't even see that it's only 8 when you have the activity of so many, of 20, of 16 wedges that are just jumping around and really catching the eye as it moves around.
So now we jump to a 9 patch.
We jump to a 9 patch because I want to show everyone why I think my patchwork is so different. It really is patchwork. I'm sewing patches together, but where the traditional quilter has contrast at the seams, black next to white next to black, because there's contrast, your eye sees the straight lines. I don't want you to see the straight lines because the patches are really vehicles to get this gorgeous fabric onto the flat surface of the quilt. I don't want you to see my patchwork. So at those seams, if I was to do a 9 patch, I would camouflage the seams. I would find if at the, I think where does the patch end? And if it ends in a red, then I'm going to start with a red on the next patch, which is one of the reasons I use a black background so much in my fabrics and look for fabric like that, because it's very easy for it to end in black and then start again with a black, even if it takes me into, completely different color stories. And this is an example using a 60-degree triangle. You see the two fabrics, you see the diagram, you see templates with the 1/4-inch seam allowance around it, and when those two patches meet with a strong contrasting line, you can see where that line is. And in the next one, the next slide, I've now used patterned fabric. I have the same patch 1 and patch 2, but my two fabrics are very complex. And in order to find the same patch, 6 times identically, I draw clues from the fabric onto the template. And so now when you see the triangle sewn together from the two pieces and then put all together, your eye doesn't see where the seams connect. And that's the basis of that's my basic strategy, camouflaging seams.
Very clever.
And here we see 160-degree triangle and then 2 sew together. So even in the first triangle, do I expect to see those whites, multiply into more of a bubble, of a sea foam as it moves around? Some of it I'm aware of, some of it I'm not so aware of, but I get to take credit for it all. So it's a great system. And then finally, we see what happens when 360-degree wedges are sewn together. A little bit of gold is bringing the eye around that you didn't even notice were put in there. So every element is important. And it doesn't really follow the traditional, cool colors, recede and warm come forward. There's a lot that ends up happening. I believe more is more, and I just want the eye to bonkers.
Wow.
And this is fitting it into the quilt. This is an unusual quilt for me. It was the first. Each quilt sort of, I get a new idea. I follow a new path, or I go back and revisit something. But in this quilt, my new idea was to actually use a very active background. Wow. And so here's the finished quilt, 94, Kaleidoscopic 12. And it's really a traditional pyramid quilt. Like, it's straight lines that go up and down, and fit together quite nicely because they're 60-degree triangles. And I didn't have enough of that first fabric that I bought in the garment district that I loved so much. So I had to go back and find a second fabric. And I think it's a much better quilt for that. The fact that the fabric that's in the center is not brought all the way out to the end, it's got much more depth and interest because there's a second fabric, which was a little unusual in 94 to really go that route.
We're now going to just talk about the Spanish synagogue ceiling quilt, which is 2018. It's a magnificent quilt, but it's sort of, again, quite different because it seems to be sort of different sections, which I expect have been inspired by the synagogue itself.
Absolutely. This quilt was, when I walked into that synagogue and looked up at the ceiling, and I just knew it was a quilt like waiting to happen. I just loved all that patterning. I only had these 2 postcards. I don't know if I didn't take photographs or they didn't come out, but I basically had these 2 photographs that I worked on for over, for about 1.5 years, 2 years. Once I got into the rhythm of the quilt, when I say I worked 2 years, I was traveling, I was teaching, I was doing a lot of designing fabric. So it wasn't constant. Mostly in the summers was when I really got to work. Once I got into it, I felt like I could have worked on that quilt for the rest of my life. I just loved all of the patterning that went on.
There's so much patterning, isn't there?
I'm just showing you, this is my way of working, just to get the sizes. It doesn't all fit together so well in the end. There's a lot of wobbliness. There's a lot of playing with it. But each of those pieces has different patterns that went into it. It's just some more for me to play off of using graph paper, because that's the way I'm used to doing it.
And so these are just some of the sections.
So these are some of the sections showing you both the piecing, the back before it got put into a quilt sandwich, the back and the piecing and the front.
Did you design fabric specifically for this quilt, or did you use a current?
I didn't, but this was not probably the first, but maybe the second time or third that I did a quilt. I made a quilt only from my own fabric. So yeah, these are all my fabrics, but no, I don't design. I design fabric, and then I kind of see what I can do with the fabric. And then also, I, even as I design it, it actually brings me back to wanting to design more. I different fabric, or I find parts of the fabric that I knew it was there, but I didn't use before. It wasn't my favorite. I come to love different parts of the fabric as I revisit them over and over, like a good book. And here, I'm very lucky. The APQS has let me, during quilt market, when they're not as busy as they are during festival, they set me up. They're wonderful technicians, just put me on the machine. And I like quilting now. Up until about 2 or 3 quilts ago, 4, I was doing hand quilting, and I'm not. Yeah, I like hand quilting. I wasn't a great hand quilter, but I certainly liked it. But I realized that, I really needed to move along a little bit. And since also I'm not leaving any spaces for hand quilting anymore, usually it used to be maybe the background was a little less pieced, but now everything is so densely pieced. So I like to just do that straight line quilting using like a pale green or a gold across the whole surface of the quilt. I'm in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 9th floor. There's no way that I could have a long arm here or anything like that.
Wow. This is one of your fabrics?
Well, this is not a fabric yet. This is a piece of the Prague Spanish synagogue ceiling. This is pieced from many, many different fabrics. And when I finished piecing this, I realized this would make a beautiful fabric. And it was getting to be, I probably finished it, if I quilted it at Houston in late October, maybe I finished this in September. So I was starting to think about fabric, because I usually do the fabric. I design the fabric at the Benetech studio, because I live in New York City and I don't have the right software on my laptop. I don't have a space for a real good printer. I commute to Benetech's on 35th Street in Manhattan. I basically live at 235th Street, so that's 200 blocks away. So I thought, this will make a great fabric. Let's make a fabric. And so on the next slides, you'll see a couple of the fabrics I used. This is from a left from Wonderlust. So there's parts of Electric Slide, and there's parts of Tangle. So these are older fabrics of mine that were in that image that I showed you. There's another fabric that I used quite a bit of, not this colorway, but I liked these that I like to use sometimes the external parts of the circle of the mandala fabrics that I use, that are sitting against the black. I love to use those surfaces, those edges. So putting those fabrics together created that group of, that's that piece. And so we used those, we scanned it, we used those fabrics. And I thought, okay, maybe it'd be great to try a fabric that is scalloped like this, instead of straight lines. Let's see what would happen if we scalloped the pattern. So this was the first image. So what I'm showing you here again, I'm reminding you how ultimately I want to have a bilaterally symmetrical fabric. I want to have a fabric that mirror images, that has that implied line down the center and a left and a right. So that's really just why I'm showing you this. I happen to love this colorway. It didn't print out quite as intensely as this one does, but it gives me such pleasure every time I see this. Like, this is the epitome for me of a fabric. But if you look at this fabric, you can actually see how it's been outlined. Every part of it is outlined. So just keep that in mind, that it has bilateral symmetry and it is outlined. This is the software that I use when I go to Benetech's, and you can see that there are 18 different colors. All my fabrics until this year were printed in Korea. Or earlier they were printed in Japan, but for many years they've been printed at a really good mill in Korea. The hand of the fabric is really lovely. The gray goods that are used are really lovely. The blacks are really nice and intense, but I can only use 18 colors, which to some people, when I say only, they'd be surprised because I mean, that Liberty print that I loved so much, that was 5 colors. And look at what a successful job that person did. But I would just whine, oh, I can't have 19 or 20. I need more color. But basically, this is the what I can use, 18 colors. The next time I do a different colorway, the black, the darkest color will always, you can see the darkest black is now color number 12. Color number 12 will always have to be the darkest. Color number 1 will always have to be the lightest. I will play with this so that eventually when I've got the pattern down, 1 is my lightest and 18 is my darkest, and the others like play through. Because when I go to the blue group or I go to another group, it still has to be in that same pattern. And here are the tools that you can use on the left. I can bucket it. I can take one color and just put it in by hand into certain places.
What
So
fun.
it is. Now that I know how to use it, it really is fun. I have a quilt, my Kaleidoscopic 2 or 3. You can see it on my website, which is an homage to my box of 64 crayons, because coloring as a little kid was my favorite thing to do. So you can, it feels like a full circle. So what if I went to college and got a master's degree? What I'm really doing is still coloring like I did when I was 5 years old. Anyway, this became that fabric. It was called Fusion, and here it is in the blue multi, and here it was I was doing 3 colorways that year: blue and the green red. In order for like red to be next to green, there has to be, when you're doing silk screen, there really has to be that line in between so that the colors fit, they stay where they belong. Otherwise, where red would meet green would be a brown. And at first, I could say, well, I don't care, I like more color, I'll be a brown. But it actually does not end up as beautiful and as intense. Like, it'll print out from the printer and paper magnificently, but when it's in fabric, it is not as wonderful. So here I did try to do some painterly kinds of images. Over the years I pushed it, but in order for those white scrolls to really be seen, you can see how there's a black outline around them. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been able to print this. And I just want to reinforce those important terms. Gray goods are those raw fabrics before we dye them and bleach them and do all sorts of stuff. So over the years, the gray goods, my fabrics have just become luscious. I mean, they're just sophisticated and they're beautiful. And so any change, I want to make sure that I still have that great hand, the really good gray goods. And the converter is the company, or really there's a person in the company who takes the gray goods, who buys those gray goods and sends them to the mill, and who makes the finished product. And here I'm going to show you my my new collection, my 2 new collections. I believe at this point it will be available probably by January. I finished it on like February 28th at like 7 o'clock at night downtown. And when I got onto the subway going uptown to the Bronx, I thought the change, the important moment was that we had finished our first digital collection. Not that within days we would have a quarantine and a pandemic, and I would never go on the subway again. But that's what this fabric is. It's digitally printed in Pakistan, which is a different mill and a very different experience. And because it's digitally printed, I can use as many colors as possible, which is a little intimidating. But the reason that the fabric companies, the converters, want to go digital, the price has gone down a lot, but also they don't have to print as much. When they did screen printing, they had to do these, couple 1,000-yard runs, while now really with digital printing, they can do very small runs and see how the audience likes their fabrics before they, do more of it. So I have 2 collections. One is that duets, which is going to be the fussy cuts, the prima donnas. They're the ones. So I divide fabric into prima donnas and then all over fabrics that you can just cut randomly. And so first we'll see duets, which are the prima donnas. And this makes my heart sing, because this is like a little miracle. These fabrics in gold, blue, and multi, I kept to the idea of doing 3 colorways per pattern. Blues were different over so many years. They were different programs, they were different, RGBs, they were different colors. Now they're just, I have no idea how many colors are in this. I don't have any idea how many kaleidoscopes, but I want you to take a look and look at the layout, look at the upper left corner of each of these, and they're different because you don't just color in anymore the way, take the say, just put, blues on top of the green colorway or something like that. It doesn't even make sense. It would have been too hard to do that because we actually laid this out 3 different times and you can't even compare it. So all the strategies are completely different.
How exciting though to have the new technology to then sort of rethink the way that you've been working. That'd be great.
Especially since I'm not that technologically proficient. I'm actually learning Photoshop now. So this is from Duets. It's called I wrote Convertina, but it's actually Concertina. So this is from Duets. It is a fabric called Concertina, and it is a true duet because I've taken 2 older patterns and put one on top of the other. So looking at this, you can see those dashes that are floating around. I mean, it's really kind of a wild, crazy pattern. So here, Rabbit Hole, which is from a collection from about 2-3 years ago. I loved this pattern because it was just so animated and so much stuff was going on. And it is the bottom layer of Concertina. Good Vibrations, you can see those dashes, and those are the dashes that go on top sometimes, and they keep getting recolored so a little bit, but it is this pattern that is put on top of the Rabbit Hole. All right, so here's the multi. So do you see how the dashes are all multicolored? So it's a multicolored dashes on top of a multicolored rabbit hole underneath it. In the next colorway, it's blue, and these blue, this Concertina has blue dashes. Now, if you look at the bottom layer, it's multicolored really. And in the next colorway, we're going to see the same bottom layer, but with different, this time it has multicolored dashes. And so it became completely different, and they didn't make me give up one for the other because I just couldn't make up my mind. So I've actually got, we have 4 colorways for Concertina. And then here, I love the golds. And this is reminiscent to me of the way that I'm quilting with a gold or like light olive stitch very much, how the gold really just falls into some places and pops out in others. So I do like the Concertina in gold very much.
They will be in the stores
hopefully soon. By January. And
all of Paula's links are down below in the description box. So please check them out and you'll be able to go to her website. And also there's a link to her Wikipedia page. I can't even say it. Her Wikipedia.
I'm pretty proud of that.
I think that's fabulous. You're the first quilter I've met that has their own Wikipedia page. So that's pretty cool.
I'm a lefty, and for each of my quilts, I make an ultra suede embellished hand. I'm drawing out my right hand on the back of it and then cutting it and making the left side. And I got stuck doing that about quilt number 2 or something, and now I've had to make one of those for each quilt. Actually, during the pandemic, this was the task making that I liked the most. You can actually see a hand I did recently on about a month ago, or on Facebook and Instagram. But that is my signature.
Lovely. That was great, Paula. I know you said you're no good at math, but they just look so complex and interesting. And I actually have a photo of myself lying down on the carpet in the Hilton because
I have the same photo.
Yes, sort of the big lying down there. People thought I was a bit odd, but I said to somebody, "Excuse me, can you just take a photo of me?" And they went, "Yes."
Thank you. I'm so glad you did. I used to ask people to step on the carpet and mush their feet all around so they'd wear the whole carpet out, And actually, over the years, they did have to replace the carpet once. And at the very end, they gave me a little present. They came to my room one night, and there was a framed piece of the carpet. So that was nice.
Good. That was great. Thank you so much for giving me your time today. I know that you're actually quite busy. I'm very grateful for the time that we've spent. Hopefully one day we can have dinner in each other's homes again.
That would be lovely. You have to come to the Bronx, yes. But I thank you for thinking of me, and I really appreciate it. And I will say that one of the things that has kept me sane for the past 8 months or so is the fact that with my little group of quilters, we've been having Zoom bees, and we just we'll sit and for an hour or so twice a week. We just know that, those 2 days we're grounded by the fact that we'll see each other, and we just sit and do our own work and share the screen and just, joke and laugh as if we were actually in the same room. So I really recommend to anybody that you do that you set that up if you feel,
Yeah,
it's
it
really
sounds a great idea. I hadn't heard of that before, and I think that sounds a really lovely idea. So I'm sure everyone's really enjoyed seeing a bit of the thought processes and backgrounds to the way Paula works, and gorgeous fabrics. They're just so lush. You just want to keep staring at them, actually, because there's so much detail in them. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button that's just going to be appearing here. Nice big click, and a thumbs up would be really good. And so thank you. And also please write comments, and that's what increases the recommendations to watch these videos, and they're becoming very, very popular, and let's just spread the word about quilting. So thanks again, and bye everybody. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.